ourpassion.dev. So if you go here, it should give you an invite to the Discord group, and that's how you can join the voice chat. I'm live in the voice chat right now. That would be the general chat right there. And let me just throw that link in the description. So I'm going to be using Vite. Vite is like Webpack, just way better. I'm quite fond of it. And anyone who knows me knows that I love Vite, and it's my go-to for any Vue.js or React project. As we found out yesterday, though, it's not so great if you just want a node.js project. And what I'm thinking I'm going to do here is just to, I'm going to build a to-do list for Vue.js, or with Vue.js. Nice, simple concept, really easy. It gives you a benchmark for what the framework does. It'll show you each of the different functionalities that it has. I'm going to be using the Options API instead of the Composition API. I heavily prefer it. Everyone's different. If you're exploring Vue.js, I would encourage you to look into both of them. I prefer the Options API because if I was going to write the style of code that you use with the with the Composition API, I would just write React. If I'm going to use Vue.js, I want the Vue.js framework, which means we have the methods, the computed properties, the watchers, the data function that returns your data, the templating. Not that you don't have the stuff in the Composition API, but it doesn't feel as much like a framework. It feels like a JavaScript application with, I guess you would say, restrictions. A JavaScript application with restrictions. So, yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. Let's just give it one more minute to make sure anyone who wants to join can join. But we can go ahead and get the project started. All I did so far was I created this folder. It has today's date and then Vue. So to create a Vite app, or we're going to do a Vue.js app, but with Vite as the bundler, Vite is going to bootstrap the application for us. It's as simple, assuming you have Node and npm installed already. You can just type npm create Vite at latest. And this will bring up a CLI tool for putting together your application. So I'm going to call this Vue to do live. Now, this is pretty cool. We get to choose if we want vanilla JavaScript, if we want Vue, React, Preact, which is basically React with less functionality, Lit Element, which is a framework that was created by Google for web components, and then Svelte, which is also another really cool framework. We're going to choose Vue. Then it's going to give us two more options. It's going to be Vue.js or Vue.ts. So Vue, this is just the regular vanilla JavaScript version of Vue. Vue with TypeScript just means that it has support for the TypeScript templating. We're going to do regular Vue. I prefer TypeScript over JavaScript, but when I'm using Vue, I don't really love the way that you use TypeScript within it. There's nothing wrong with it. It just feels different to me. If I'm building anything on the back end on the server, it's TypeScript 10 out of 10 times. If I'm doing it on the front end, it depends if I'm using React or Vue. I might prefer TypeScript with Vue. TypeScript with React, and then JavaScript with Vue. So we're just going to choose Vue. So unlike with Webpack, when you use Webpack, let's say you're creating a React app and you do npx create React app. It's going to use Webpack and it's going to install all of the dependencies for you. What this did is it created the folder with the project structure inside of it. So if we list it, if we list what's inside of there, you see that we have a project structure. So let's cd or change directories into that. And now we need to install the dependencies. So I'm going to open up VS Code, install the dependencies, and then we'll get started. So that's opening VS Code right there. And now I'm going to do Control tilde to open up my terminal and npm install. I don't know why I keep getting this error because I already have it installed, as I double checked yesterday. One more thing I'm going to do, although it won't matter for this project, but if you're using environment variables for any reason, you're going to want to go into your Vite config, or I'm sorry, your git ignore, and add .env in here. I made a mistake the other day. I assumed that that was already included in the git ignore, and I ended up pushing a Google API key. What was it? For Google Books to GitHub. It's not a good thing to do. So I'm just going to point that out as long as we're right here. Now all of our dependencies are installed. If we go to our package.json file, we can see what that is. All we have is we have Vite installed as a dev dependency. We have the Vue plugin for Vite, and then the actual dependency is Vue. That's Vue.js. We're in version 3, which means we can use the composition API or the options API. Then we have a few scripts. We have dev, preview, and build. Now, preview, if I'm being completely honest, I just don't understand what the purpose of it is. It seems to just start a dev server, but on a different port. I'm sure there's a reason for it. I've never really looked into it. I've never had the need to use it. So dev is what we're going to use to actually start the dev server. So I'm just going to run npm run dev, and that's going to start our dev server at localhost 3000. If we open that up, we have our Vue.js application. So let me zoom in a little bit. And if we click this, the count, it's going to go up. We have a link to the Vite documentation and then the Vue 3 documentation. They recommend VS Code with Volar. Volar, if you don't already know, is an extension for VS Code. It's the predecessor. No, I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. Viter, which is V-E-T-U-R, was the original Vue.js extension for VS Code. It provided all the language support so that you get the correct syntax with your directives within your templating. It let you know if you had props, for example, that weren't being populated. It's very helpful. Now, Volar, this is the newer one, and this is what you're going to want if you're working with Vue 3, especially if you're working with the composition API or with TypeScript. I have both of them installed. Don't do that. Only install Volar right now, unless you're working with specifically something like version 2 with the options API. Then Viter might be a little bit better, but if you're working with version 3, whether it's the options API or the composition API, I think Volar is the correct choice these days. I have some special configuration setups so that they don't clash with each other, but ordinarily they're going to clash with each other if you have them both installed without modifying a bunch of settings. All right, so let's take a look. Is anyone in here? No. Well, that's okay. I'm going to leave the recording up this time. I deleted the recording from yesterday, but I'll leave this one up, so at least if you didn't catch this live, you'll still have the ability to watch it. And let me move some stuff around. Okay. One more thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to, just like I did yesterday, I'm going to add the Tailwind Cdn. Now, the reason I'm doing this is just because I don't want to get bogged down with styling. The styling isn't what's important. The framework, the way that the framework or the library works, that's what's important. The purpose of this is to show you what it's like to work with Vue.js, give you an idea of what the development experience is like. We're not going to worry about teaching how to use Tailwind. We're not going to worry about anything style related. I'm adding it just so I can quickly add a little bit of style on the fly, especially when we want to start marking our to-dos off as being completed or hidden. However we go about doing that, I think it's just going to be a little bit faster if I'm using Tailwind. And if there's anything that I do that doesn't make sense, please let me know and I'll explain it. So here we go. I'm going to the Tailwind Cdn. I'm just going to steal this script tag right here and throw that on my index.html. And let's change the title from Vite app to Vue to do live. So there's a few things to note. Since we used Vite, it bootstrapped the application for us. There's not really any setup that we need to do to get this up and running. So let's just take a look at what it did for us. First of all, this index.html file, this is what's important here. We have this ID of app. So if you're familiar with HTML and how you interact with the DOM, that's the document object model, or the browser basically, the way that you interact with it with maybe jQuery if you got into web development 10 years ago, or if you're doing it these days, why don't I just show a quick example? Maybe that would be easier. So we have a web page here, and if we open up our console, I can type document. So the document refers to the entire document, all of the HTML that's behind this page. So let's just console log this, and let's see what that gives us. Let's expand this. So we have all of the HTML. So when we type document, we're referring to the document. Now let's look for an ID. Something here is going to have an ID. Something in the body specifically. So we have this iframe. Let me make this a little bit smaller so we can find out what this iframe is. It's the background image. So if we want the background image, we can see, maybe I can zoom in a little bit. We can see that the ID is background image. So let's go ahead and see if we can pull that. We'll say document.query selector. We'll do query selector all. And you have to forgive me if I don't get this right on the first time, just because I don't ever write imperative JavaScript to manipulate the DOM anymore. But we paste in that ID right there. And since it's if it was a class, we would put a period before it. Since it's an ID, we put the hash symbol before it. So now you can see the autocomplete. It's anticipating that we're about to have an iframe with the ID of background image. We can save this to a constant. We'll say const image equals, and then we'll save it. And now if we console log image, we have that DOM element right there. So that's the iframe. So that's how you interact with IDs within the DOM. So the reason I wanted to show that is because if we go back to Vue.js, or back to our code here, we have this ID of app. Let's actually go to localhost 3000. Okay. So this is the application. The reason that the Vue logo is over on the left side is because we have Tailwind, which is overriding the CSS that came with this template here. But if we want to get that, if we want to reference the HTML document so that we can mount something within the HTML document, we do document.get, or we'll say document.query selector all. And then again, the ID is app. So we're going to do hashtag app. And now you can see, I'll zoom in again. You can see that it's got the node, that div. It has that saved to the memory now. So all that we're doing is we're mounting our instance of Vue.js into that div. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Okay. So I'll get back to that in just a second. Right underneath that, we have this script. We're referencing, it's a module, which means that we're importing it from another JavaScript file. And we're referencing within the source folder, there's this main.js file. So if we go to source, we have main.js. Let's see what's happening here. we're pulling in, let's see, bear with me for 1 second. I'm just going to see if there's a way that I can make this a little bit bigger. Okay. We want this to be for the workspace, not the user. And okay, that's a little much. That's probably better. Okay. So again, we have this main.js file within our source folder. And we're importing create app, which is a named import from Vue. And then we're importing this app.vue file, which is a single file component. And then we're mounting the single file component with the div ID of app, which again is this div right here. So we're taking our Vue.js application and we're mounting it into this div. That's exactly what's happening in this main.js file. So now let's take a look at what a single file component looks like. So we're importing app from app.vue. So let's take a look at app.vue. I mentioned this yesterday, but just for good measure, what I'm going to do is, this is the Vue 3 standard, I guess, where we have the script up at the top. I'm going to move the script down to under the template. I mentioned this again yesterday, but I'm going to say it again. This is how I learned Vue, and even though it doesn't make any difference at all, this is how I prefer to structure my components. Now, if we have the script up at the top, this is sort of copying the way that Svelte works. Svelte is a really cool framework. I think it's a lot of fun to use. I think it has a very bright future, but that's not how I want to structure my single file components. I want to do it the good old fashioned way. One more thing that's worth noting is if you're getting into Vue.js, you're going to want to go to your extensions toolbar here, or sidebar, and type in Drasner. There's this woman, Sarah Drasner, and I think she was on the Vue core team for a while. And now, if I'm not mistaken, she's working for Vercel. And yeah, she's a very, very impressive software engineer. She has this package here called Vue VS Code Snippets. Just go ahead and install this package. It's just a bunch of other packages. Oh no, I'm sorry. I misspoke there. This is going to be everything that you need for Vue in terms of snippets. There's another package, however, the Vue VS Code extension pack, also by Sarah Drasner, and this is going to have all of the extensions that you need. One thing to be mindful of, this isn't just for Vue, this is for, you know, any JavaScript or node.js work that you're doing, like bracket pair colorizer, incredibly helpful. Bookmarks, it's really cool. I never remember to use it. I actually don't think I have it installed right now. And then Night Owl is a theme that she created. I think it's nice, but I like to use a theme called Winter is Coming. That's what you're looking at right now. Anyways, these are two really good packages to install. This one is a little bit more important because there's a lot of keyboard shortcuts or hotkeys that I'm going to use from that. You don't need it. It just makes your life a little bit easier. So now let's take a look at what's going on inside of the single file component. We have the template. This is our HTML. We have the script. This is our JavaScript. And then we have the style. The style is just our CSS. We're using Tailwind right now, so I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of the CSS. So we'll leave this empty style tag there. I think technically you can delete it altogether, although I always leave it in there. You never know when you're going to need to throw a little bit of styling in. As you can see, everything is just in between the tags. So we have our script tags, we have our template tags, and our style tags. This is a blank Vue.js single file component. So the reason I brought up that extension is because there's a snippet that I use whenever I want to start a new Vue component. And that's going to be vbase CSS. And it's going to just bootstrap a component for you. But before we do that again, let me just pull up everything we had before so I can explain this. The word setup is in the script tag. This is specific to Vue.js. This is if you're using Vue 3 with the composition API and you don't want to write the setup method. Don't worry if that doesn't make any sense to you. We're not going to be using it today. We're just going to delete it entirely. We can go over the composition API on another day. I just strongly prefer the options API. What we're doing here, this image tag, I'm assuming you already know some HTML. All we're doing is we're importing the Vue.js logo. There's the Vue.js logo right in our assets folder within source. So we're just displaying that. We can get rid of that. This is how you import, or not how you import, this is how you embed a single file component. So right now we're in the app.vue component, and this hello world component inside of our components folder, that's what we're showing right here. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. We're actually going to delete this hello world component completely. We're going to delete all of this inside of our app.vue, and we'll type vbase CSS, and there we go. We have our single file component. Now, the first thing that I like to do when I set up a new component is I like to type name and then the name of the component. In this case, it's app.vue. We don't need the .vue. We're just going to type app. We're going to keep the first letter capitalized, as is standard in Vue.js. Your components should use Pascal case. So if your component name is list item, your component name would be spelled like this. Okay. So you can see that the style is scoped. This is something that is going to be important. We are not going to deal with it much today. We're going to have a bunch of different components when you're working with Vue.js. If it says scoped, that means that any CSS that you put in these tags is going to be specific to only this component. If it doesn't say scoped, then the CSS is going to go downstream to every component from there. At least I believe that's how it works. The way that I normally do it, and the reason that I don't want to say definitively, is simply because the way that I use it, I make the app.vue. Any styling that's in here is global. So I get rid of that scoped declaration. And then every component under that is going to be scoped. That's how I like to build my applications. All right. So let's actually start building something now. This, as I mentioned, is going to be just a standard to-do app. Just a to-do list. We're going to learn a little bit about component-based architecture, and we're going to learn a little bit about the Vue.js options API. And we have a good starting point here. The first thing that I want to say is that I'm going to be using Tailwind. I already mentioned this. Just if you don't understand something about Tailwind, this isn't really the time to talk about it. We can go over Tailwind some other time. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I just think it's going to be a little bit faster to put together something that looks decent for this particular example. So what we're going to do here, let's just give it a title, just so we can see something reflect on the page. Let's put an H1 in here, and let's just say hello world. And since I'm using Tailwind, I'm just going to say class, and we'll say text 2XL. Since I'm only using the Tailwind CDN instead of actually having Tailwind properly configured, I might get some of these classes wrong and have to play around because my IntelliSense isn't working. But let's take a look and see. Okay, so we have hello world. And let's see why we're getting some errors. That must be just from playing around with it. All right, so we have hello world. Let's change this to do, or we'll say tasks. So when we think about a to-do list, what do we want this to-do list to have? It's going to have an input where you can type a new task that you want to add. You are going to have a button so that you can you can add the task, right? So once you have something typed in, you'll have a button. You press the button, it adds the tasks to your to-do list. And then when that happens, we need to clear the input and allow for the next task to be entered. So that's where we're going to start. The first thing that we're going to throw in here is going to be an input. Now, the next thing that we have to figure out here is how do we make our input so that we have two-way data binding, and where do we store our variables? Because right now, if we take a look at this, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of styling, we're going to say border 2, border black, and rounded medium. So if we take a look, this is what we have now. We have this input with nothing in there. We could type, but there's nothing to do with it from there. One more thing is I'm just going to center all of this. So I'm going to take this outer div. I'm going to give it a full width. I'm going to make it a flex. Yeah, that's what I want to do. And then I'm going to create a section here. This section is going to be for the input area. Let's give it an ID called input area. Now, we don't need this. I'm only putting this in here to make things a little bit more clear. And we'll get rid of this sidebar for now, so we just have the code. All right, so if we take a look again, nothing has changed here. But now that we have this section wrapping our input, now we can, since this is flex, we could set the margin on this to auto. And let's see, we don't want to do that in the ID, we want to do that in the class. There we go, now it's centered. As far as this tasks right there, let's also center that. And we'll say text center. There we go, so now it's centered. And I think font semi-bold would be cool. Alright, so now it's also bold. Alright, so far so good. Let's make the input a little bit wider. And we're also going to have to make this section wider. Alright, so now it's huge. So let's also give it a little bit of padding on the side. We'll say px 8. There we go, now we have a padding of 8 on each of the sides. One thing that you might notice is since we have this rounded, we actually have, this looks a little bit weird because the cursor is actually almost like popping out of this input. So let's add a little bit of padding also inside of the input. And this is all aesthetic, don't worry about any of this stuff. Alright, so we'll say px2. And there we go, now we have a little bit of a buffer from the side. One more thing that we can do, which is even a little bit weird, but we can even center the text in there, I think. So now if we type, it starts right in the middle. Why not? I think it looks a little goofy, but it's kind of cool. I think maybe we can make this width 1/2 instead of full. It might look a little bit better. Yeah, so now we can enter our task here. All right, so we have a good start. We're going to need a button so that we can actually add the task. And we're going to hide the button in just a little bit. I think this is one of those neat little tricks. If we add the button here, and we'll say add task, now we have this button. I'll give it a border. Say border 2 and border black. We also want it to be rounded, MD for medium. All right, so now it looks a little bit more like a button. We don't need to worry about the styling because we're going to hide the button in just a few minutes. But now there's two things we have to do. The first thing is, how do we get something that we type in the input, how do we get that to save as a variable? And then the next thing is, how do we get this button to trigger some sort of action to add the task. So these are the first two things that we're going to do. Now Vue has something called directives. If you're familiar with Angular, it's going to look very familiar. If you use React, then this isn't going to look familiar, but it's going to be really cool. This is a huge reason why I love Vue.js. What a directive is it's a tag that you put inside of your HTML. And it makes some things that are a little bit more on the complicated side with React, something that you would normally use JSX for. It makes it incredibly easy. So the directive that we're going to be using with input is called vModel. What vModel does is it sets up two-way data binding, but we don't have anything to bind it to yet. So let's go down to our script section. Unfortunately, you can't just start putting variables in here and say const new task equals empty string. You can't do something like that, but that's okay because it's almost that easy. Now, we have this name right here. You don't need to worry about that too much. The reason we put this name in here is specifically when we're debugging. Vue has something really cool called Vue Dev Tools. And if we refresh the page and pull this up, now you can see we have the Vue tab right here. If we go to this will give us a breakdown of our app. We don't really have anything right now. We have this one component called app. We don't have anything in there. But that's why you want to put the name in there. This name where you see app, it's getting that from right here. So that's why we put the name in there. The next one that we're going to do, and keep in mind that these don't have to be in any specific order. There's an order that I like to use, but it will work no matter what order you use these in. And this is why it's called the Options API. Think about it like this. Your script tag has this default export. This is an object. Everything that's in this object is an option. You're giving it options for your component. Those options are going to consist of the functions, which are technically methods because it's part of the component. So when you think about class, the way that you use classes in JavaScript, if you have a function inside of a class, that's a method. Same thing as a function, the context is just different. So we have data. The data is going to be our variables. Our variables that we're allowed to edit, mutate, modify, whatever. We're going to have methods, which are our functions. We're going to have computed properties. And those are going to be, a good example would be, maybe we have two variables in our data. We have variable x and variable y. We want to add those two variables together. Let's say they're integers, the number 1 and the number 3. We could have a computed property called xy_sum, and what that's going to do is it's going to be a function that returns the data values. So the function might say return x plus y. So your computed property is going to be the sum of those two values. And you'll see that in practice. So I know I didn't explain that very well, but it's a lot simpler than it sounds. We're going to have our components, which is where we're going to register any components that we import into the application. We can have watchers. Keep in mind that all of these are optional. We don't need any of these. We only need the ones that we're going to use. So yeah, we have watchers. If we want something to happen when a value changes, let's say, again, we have that computed property that's called sum. What we can do with that is when the sum changes, we can trigger some event that we want to happen. Oh, is that an old message? Yeah. Okay, well. Hello. All right, if anyone who's here wants to jump into the voice chat to ask questions or anything, you're more than welcome to do that. I'm doing this specifically to teach Vue.js to anyone who's interested in learning it right now. So I'm not concerned about the VOD or anything like that. Don't feel like you're going to mess something up if you want to jump in. Or if you need me to start anything over or explain anything, just let me know. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, although yesterday someone was spamming the chat and I just totally didn't notice it until right before I signed off. But yeah, feel free to hop in the voice chat. Feel free to send a message, preferably on Discord, because I'll hear the notification that way at least. All right, cool. Okay. Gotcha. Okay, so yeah, we have, let me actually do this instead. I'll clear this out in just a minute. But another reason why I brought up that extension is because we have some really cool shortcuts that are going to help. So for example, we want to add our data object here. We can type vdata. Now v obviously because it's Vue. So vdata, and it's going to bootstrap our data object for us. I'll explain it in just a second. Same thing with methods. Vmethod, and it creates a standard method for us called name. The reason it says name is for no reason at all. It's just the way that the template was set up. So we're going to delete this or rename it. We also have our computed properties. We could do vcompu. You have to put the U in there because it'll do components if you don't. So these are our computed properties. And then vcomp for components. And then we have watchers, which can go up here. Again, the order does not matter at all. The only purpose of this stuff is to show you guys what the different options are. And we'll see how all of them work. We're not going to use all of these default ones. Okay. So before we actually start the to-do list, let's just see what each of these does. Right now, I'm going to comment out components because we don't have any components to import. In our data section here, I'll comment out the watchers also. All right, so in our data section, all of our variables, the way that we're going to look at it is our variables are key value pairs. This data function returns an object, and that object contains all of our local state, all of the variables from this particular component. So if we have a variable called number1 with a value of 1 and number2 with a value of 4, you could see that this is just a JavaScript object right here. So if this was a vanilla JavaScript application, it would be like having let num1 equals 1, let number2 equals 4. Think of it like this for all intents and purposes. This is what we just did. So what we can do now, and this is one of the other cool things about Vue, is that templating is incredibly easy. So if we'll get rid of this vModel for a second, because I just want to show this demonstration. If we put double curly braces here, now we can reference anything from our script tag. So if we want number1, all we have to do is type num1. If we want another one for num2, we would do it like this. Now if we look at our application, there we go. That's number1 and number2. Now for our computed properties, let's say we want the sum, like I was just mentioning, we would do it like this. We would say sum, and that's going to be the name of this computed property, and we want it to return this dot num1 plus this dot num2. We have to use the this keyword because we're referencing this component. The reason you don't have to do it inside of the template is because Vue uses a compiler behind the scenes. The compiler knows that we're referencing this component. So it's automatically going to essentially, it's going to know where to look for these values. If we're doing it down here, most of this is just JavaScript. So we need to be a little bit more specific with it. So we have return this.num1 plus this.num2. So now if we want to reference this computed property, we can do this. Let's change this to plus. So it should say number 1, which is 1, plus number 2, which is 4, and then the sum is going to be 5. So let's see if it worked out. Let me just swap these around. There we go. 1 plus 4 equals 5. So that's pretty cool. Let's throw in a button real quick. And on this button, I'll explain what this means in a second. So I'm going to add an onClick listener. We're going to give the button a label that says +1. And when you click this button, what we want to do is we want to take the number 1, and let's say that we want to increment it. So we'll say num1 plus plus. So now if we take a look here, I'm sorry, bear with me for 1 second because I keep forgetting we have Tailwind. Let me give it a class. Okay, so here's our ugly little button here. But when we click it, we see the number is incrementing. And while it's incrementing, our computed property is also changing because the computed property is reactive based on the dependencies. The dependencies are number 1 and number 2. Anytime either of them changes, our computed property will also change. Now, while we have this going on, I can explain what watchers are. I'll uncomment this. In order to use a watcher, again, you can see all of this stuff, it's all just objects. So all we need to do is make sure that the name of the method within this watcher matches the data value. So what I mean by that is, let's say sum. I want to give this the same name as the value that I want to watch. Now it knows which value we're watching. It's going to have access to the old value and the new value. So we can do this. We can say console, console log new value, old value. So anytime the sum changes, we're going to log out the old value and the new value. Let's see what that looks like. You can see down here, every time we click it, we have a new console log. So within this function right here, we can say if, we'll say if, okay, let's do this. If this dot num1 is greater than this dot num2, then we're going to console log that the new value has exceeded this dot num2. I think that makes sense. So let's try that out. We click this. Whoops. Okay. We click this, and right now it's 2. 2 plus 4. We click it again, 3 plus 4. Click it again, 4 plus 4. Now we know that when we click it again, it's going to, number 1 is going to exceed number 2. There we go. 9 has exceeded 4. We click it again. It'll say 10 has exceeded 4. 11 has exceeded 4. So that's an idea of when you might want to use watchers. But we can go ahead and delete this for now that you know what it does. So now we know what data does, and we know what computed does. Methods are arguably the most important part of it, because these are all of the functions. This is where you give your application functionality. So just like we have this button right here, where it adds 1, and we're doing it inside of this onClick event, what we can do, and this would be a much better idea, this better practices, what we can do is instead of putting the logic right in there, we can just put a pointer. We can reference the method that we want to call. So let's make a method called increment. And inside of this method, what we want to do is we want to say number1 equals number1 plus 1. So this dot num1 equals this dot num1 plus 1. And now we can reference this name here, increment, by pasting it in there. So now every time we click the button, we're going to get the same result as we did last time, where it increments, but we're doing this in a cleaner, more semantically appropriate way, I guess you would say. But the thing is, you can't only invoke methods from the template. You're going to use methods all over the place. You're going to have methods referencing other methods. You're going to have methods that are being triggered when a watcher catches something. You're going to have things that might trigger asynchronously. Whatever the case is, methods are just functions. Any functionality that you need for your single file component is going to happen within these methods here. So let's go ahead and get rid of increment because we don't need it anymore. I'll actually get rid of this method section altogether. I'll get rid of computed now that you see what that does. I'll get rid of components because we don't have anything to import. And we'll just leave the data in here for now. So let's actually get back to the app. We'll get rid of all of these numbers. We'll get rid of this button. And now that you saw how all those different things work, let's create a binding for our input. So again, we have that directive. It's going to be called vModel or viewModel. And we're going to say that we want to have the two-way data binding attached to a variable. That variable is going to be called new task. So now we have to create that variable. And again, that's going to be inside of this object that we're returning from data. So new task, and let's give it a default value of an empty string. So now we need to test when we type in this input, we need to find out, is the input binding to our data? The way that we can verify this right now is we can throw a template in here and we can say new task. So as soon as we start typing into that input now, we should see the box move over as the name of the task appears not only in the box, but also to the left of the box. So let's see if that happens. We start typing. Okay, I say to the left of the box, but I forgot we have a little bit of formatting here. As we type, we have our two-way data binding. If this was React, it would be a lot more complicated than that. So that's one of the cool things about Vue. And rendering lists, iterating over things, there's a lot of things that are just easier with Vue. Not that I don't love React, because I do absolutely love React. But there's a reason that I like using Vue so much. It just makes so many things so easy to do. So now we have our two-way data binding. What we can do from here is we need to be able to save that value. So when we click this add task button, we want it to take the task that's in here. We want to throw that value into an array somewhere and then clear this out so we can start entering our next task. So let's start by creating an array, and this array is going to contain all of our tasks. So let's say tasks, and it's going to be an empty array. So now that we have that instantiated, we need to be able to push the tasks into there. One more thing I'm going to say about this before we get started with adding our tasks is that we're going to want our tasks to be objects. So let's see, what do I mean by that? This would be a good time for us. There's a few different ways we could do it, but I think this could be a good opportunity to use a computed property. So let's say we have a computed property, and we'll call it new task object. So when you think about what is a task, it's going to be the name of the task. So wash dishes, do laundry, whatever. The next thing that you're going to have on there is going to be a status. Maybe it's completed or it's pending. Another thing that we're going to need is going to be an ID. We don't really need it for the sake of this example, but if you're building an application, you're going to want an ID, so let's try to keep it a little bit realistic. So what would this new task object look like? We don't have to return it just like this. What we can do instead is we can create the object up here, and then we can return it at the end. So let's say const new task object equals ID, name, and status. And then here's what I'll do. Let me just make this an object. So the ID, the way that we're going to do this ID, I think, and again, you're not going to want to do this in production, but for this particular example, let's say that the ID is going to be equivalent to the number of tasks that we have plus 1. So that way, each task is going to have a new ID, and it's also going to be in order from the first one we entered into the last one. So we can do this by saying this.tasks.length plus 1. So that's our ID. The name, this is going to come from this new task value. So we say this.newTask, and then the status, by default, let's actually do it this way instead. Instead of saying status, let's make this a Boolean. So we'll say complete, and we'll set the default value to false. Now we're going to return this new task object. Again, another way to do it would just be to return the object just like that. And maybe that is the cleaner way to do it. We'll do it that way. But I just wanted to point out that you can have stuff happen at the top of the computed property before you return a value. Every computed property needs to end by returning a value. So this will work. And just for the sake of demonstration, let's do this. Let me just throw this in the template. The new task object right here. And I'm going to throw this inside of a code and a pre tag. Pre stands for preserve. It means that we want to preserve the spacing. So let me clean that up. And let's see what it looks like once we start entering a task. There we go. I mean, that's all we can really see right now. If we start typing, it updates the task. So now when we click add task, we need to take this object right here, and we need to add it to our array. So underneath this object, or let's say above it, let's say we also want to show our tasks. So I'll just type tasks. So now when we click the button, the way that you do this, you're going to use a directive called onClick. So since it's a Vue directive, it starts with v dash. Then we do onClick equals, and then what do we want to happen on click? I'm going to say add task handler, which is going to be a method that we're going to have to create. So we're going to create methods. We're going to call it add task handler. And then what it's going to do is it's going to say this.tasks.push. And the value that we're pushing into that array is going to be this.newTaskObject, because we're referencing this computed property now. Okay, so let's see if that works. We'll say do dishes. So again, we have our object right here. We click add task, and you can see this is our array. It added the task to our array. Now we have the second task already ready to go with an ID of 2, because that's the length of this array plus 1. It still says do dishes because we didn't clear out this. If we delete that, now we see that we have another blank task template. And as soon as we enter something and throw it in here, we'll see what happens. Mow lawn. Add task. Now we have 2 objects inside of our array. And we have the third one ready to go. But again, we still have mow lawn in there. So there we go. Everything's working as expected. What we want to do is inside of this add task handler, we want to make sure that we clear out the new task. So we're going to say this dot new task equals, and we're going to set that to an empty string. So when we try this again, do dishes, and then we click add task. There we go, it's in there. But now it clears this out. The second one's ready to go. So that's perfect. There's another issue with how this is set up here. If we go back here, we can just start adding as many tasks as we want by clicking add task over and over. So if we scroll down, now we have all of these empty tasks. So what we want to do is we want to say if this.new task, and we could say if it's null, basically. It's the same thing as saying something like that. So I'm just going to put the exclamation point before it. We're going to say if this.new task is null, then return. It's that simple. To make this a little bit more verbose, it would be like this. Return else. So we're going to say if there's nothing there, return from this method. Otherwise, push this object into the array and then clear the task. So let's take a look at this. Task 1. We click add task. There we go. Task 2. Add task. But now if I start clicking this like crazy, we scroll down and all we have are these 2 tasks in the array and then the third task, which is ready to be added to the array. So again, I'm going to simplify this code just because it does the exact same thing even without the curly braces. I think it just looks a little bit more readable. And we can get rid of this else clause because the else clause isn't going to be reached if this is true. So this is going to do exactly the same thing. Now, moving on from here, one more thing that might be helpful is just to have the number of tasks up here. Again, this can be a computed property. We can say task count. And then we're going to return this.tasks.length. Now you see that we're getting this error here. That's because these computed properties, this is nothing but an object full of methods or functions. That means that we have to add a comma here because this is an object. It's really just that simple. We have to just separate all of our computed properties by commas and we're good to go. Now up at the top, we have tasks right here. We can throw in a template and we could say task count, because I think that's what we named it. 0 tasks. Something else that would be good to do right now is that if there's one task, we don't want it to say tasks. So we're going to use a ternary operator here or some inline logic. We can also wrap this text inside of templates just like that. But now we're going to get an error if we save it. Let's take a look. We go back here and it's not showing up. I'm actually surprised. We should have an error in here saying that, oh yeah, property tasks was accessed, but it's not defined on the instance. That's because now it thinks that this is a variable. What we're going to do to avoid that is we're going to put that inside of quotes. Now if we go back, we're going to have the exact same thing as when we started. We have 0 tasks. So what we're going to do here is we can say task count equals 1. So if there's only one task, then we want it to say task. Otherwise, we want it to say tasks, plural. So you can have this inline logic like that. So if we go back, we refresh, we type task 1, it's going to go from 0 tasks to 1 task. And now if we add another one, just throw in some text there, it should go from 1 task to 2 tasks, right? So that's just one of the cool things that you can do with that inline templating. There's a million ways to do everything. So you could also do that with a computed property. You could even do that with a watcher that updates a variable when the value is only 1 for the length. There's no shortage of ways to do this. You can even reference the length of the array directly in line instead of having a computed property to do that. So, all right, let's keep the ball rolling here. So far, so good. So we have the input saved as a variable already. And get rid of that note right there. One of the cool things about Vue is that we also have these shorthands here. So instead of doing v on click, which is just an on click listener, the shortcut we can do is we can just have the @click like that. That does the exact same thing. I think it looks a little bit nicer. It's nice and easy to read. Whenever I look at this now, I just read it as on click. So on click, we're referencing add task handler. Perfect. Now now that you see how all of this code is working, I'm gonna go ahead and delete this. We don't need it anymore. But we do need to show our tasks in a more readable way. So I'll show you how you're gonna render a list now. And just for the sake of not having to type this in every single time we have a new task, let me throw a few dummy tasks in here, just so we have some dummy data to work with. Let's say that we have an ID of 1. We have a name of Molon, and then complete is going to be false. And then we're going to just clone this task. So we have ID 2, buy groceries. And complete is going to be false. So now, how do we render these onto the application? This is just as easy as anything else we've done so far. Underneath our button here, let's actually give it a new section. And let's give the section an ID of task list. Again, the ID does absolutely nothing. That's just for our purposes. We're going to have an unordered list, and the unordered list is going to have a list item. So just UL for unordered list, LI for list item. And let's just throw tasks in here. And let's take a look at it. So now we have our tasks. And bear with me for 1 minute because I want to fix that styling. Okay, that's better. Let's also make the width of this 50%. And then we'll make this flex. And then we'll set this to mauto as a class. Again, this is Tailwind CSS if you're not familiar with it. And what am I doing wrong here? Do we need to justify this? Oh, okay. That's the list item. That's okay. We don't need to have it formatted super nice. Maybe a better way to do this would just be to... I would like it centered, if I'm being completely honest. Let's just give it at least a little bit of padding off the sides, or margin rather. So let's say margin, or margin on the x-axis rather. Let's give it a value of 12. There we go. At least it's not right up against the side there. So we have our tasks being printed out, and the tasks is just an array with 2 objects in it. This isn't what we want. What we want is we want them to iterate as a list. The way that you do this in Vue, very, very easy. On the list item, we're going to add a directive called v4. And we're going to say that we want it to display something for each task within the tasks array. So we'll say v4 task in tasks. So what this is doing is it's taking the task array, and then for each iteration of the array, it's creating a new variable called task, 1 for each loop. Now, just like with a for each loop in JavaScript, we can use that same sort of idea with the syntax to get the index. If we wrap it in parentheses and then we do comma I, we're going to get the index of each of these. And I'll demonstrate this by changing tasks to I for index. And although we have this error, I'll get to this error in just a second, I think it might still render. So let's try. Let's see if it works. There we go. So we have a list that's rendering, and it's 0 for index 0 and 1 for index 1 because we have 2 items. We have 2 tasks right now. So if we go back, we change this to task instead. Now we get this object. We get our task object. These are the 2 objects that were inside of our tasks array. So we don't want the task, the full task object. We just want the task name. All we have to do is do task.name. We go back, and now we have exactly what we want. So why are we getting this error? That's because we need a key in here. So Vue has something called bindings. You can see my autocomplete's trying to recommend that we have a key. The way that we would go about this normally, see if we have this key object here and we put something in there, it's a string. You can tell because of the green syntax highlighting. Now, if we don't want that to happen, if we want this to be a variable, we're going to use vbind, just like it's showing right here. Vbind, and now, well, we need to change this to something that'll work. It needs to be a unique value. You would think, well, can I just put the task name in there or the task ID? You can do the task ID. I wouldn't do task name because the task name it might not be unique. Let's say that this is a list of all your tasks over the course of a week. You might have a task that repeats. You don't want to use the name because you don't want duplicate values. The reason for that is this key is how the DOM determines what each task is. If they have the same ID, the DOM can't tell the difference between 2 different tasks that have the same ID. So the cool thing about this is we can get rid of that if we want to. But the reason I like to leave it in there is because if we have the index, we can use the index as a key. So we change this to just I, and now suddenly it's exactly as we would want it to be. The index is going to be different each time because it's going to be the number of the iteration that we're on, or the index of the iteration that we're on. And then we're going to get our task name. Everything will render perfectly. One more thing that's cool about Vue, just like we have this @click shortcut instead of v_on_click, we can get rid of vbind entirely, and as long as this starts with a colon, it's still going to work. The way that I would think about vbind with Vue.js, the same way that we can think about just the just the colon, is that if we want to turn a string within our template, if we want to turn a string into a variable, all we have to do is prefix it with the colon. See, it goes from being strings, now suddenly these are variables. So that's something very important to keep in mind. We're going to use a lot of that at some point. Don't be confused by vbind. It's not confusing, and I'm sure that once you see another example or two, especially when we get to the styling in a few minutes, everything will click for you if it hasn't already. All right, so let's take a look. We have all of our tasks rendering. We have the ability to add tasks. So let's try adding another one. Let's say do dishes. We'll add the task. There we go, do dishes. Everything's working as expected at this point. One thing that I'd like to do is when I type in a task, I like to be able to hit enter to add it. We can't do that right now. So if you're familiar with doing this with vanilla JavaScript or even with React, it's pretty complicated, right? If it's vanilla JavaScript, you're going to have to add an event listener on the window or on the page, and it's going to have to listen for the key to be pressed. Then it's going to have to filter out that key press, listening for the enter key. And then if the enter key is pressed, then it's going to have to trigger whatever you need it to do. What I'm going to do here, and this actually isn't specific to Vue, this is just in general something you can do anytime you're doing web development. we can wrap this input and this button in a form element. So we're going to do form, and then I might have to reference the documentation for this because I always forget exactly what the syntax is, but there's a default behavior that we don't want. And let me show you what that default behavior is. All right, if I add a task here, which is going to be some nonsense, I hit enter, the application reloads, we get this question mark in the bar right there, and our data resets. That's not what we want. So let me just do a quick search to remember the syntax. And there's a way that you can do it right in the templating. So that's what I'm looking for. Here we go. This should be it. Okay. Form, submit, prevent. So we have form, and then we're going to have submit.prevent. Now we're going to need to use v-on because it's Vue. So we're saying on submit, the default is that we want to prevent the default behavior. So if you're familiar, like I said, with React or with just vanilla JavaScript with the DOM manipulation, you would normally do this by having an event that's generated when the form is submitted, and then you would pull that event object, and then you would call the prevent default method in there. So it's really nice to be able to do this right from within the template. And we could change this v-on to the @ symbol, and that will do the same thing. Anytime you have v-on, you can replace it with the @ symbol. You're going to get the same exact effect. So now if we try this again, we hit enter, and there we go. We can just add our tasks like that. I'm going to get rid of that just because it's bothering me, although it doesn't really make a difference. And now that we have the ability to do this, let's get rid of this add task button. We still want to leave it there, but we want to hide it. So we're going to add a class, hidden. And since it's Tailwind, it just works. All right, and let's add a placeholder on this input also. So this placeholder is going to say add task. Now, the interesting thing about this is normally you would never have this be dynamic, but since we're using Vue and we have these directives and these bindings, we can make it interactive. So let's say that we want the placeholder, instead of saying add task when there's nothing there, maybe instead we want it to say add fourth task, add fifth task, and have it change every time. Kind of a stupid use case, but again, just to demonstrate how this is done in Vue, we can make this a binding just by adding the colon there. And the placeholder can say, again, we have to wrap these in strings now because it's now looking for a variable. This becomes a JavaScript expression once you bind it. So what we can do is let's actually add template strings. Or, I'm sorry, let's just do it like this. It might be a little bit simpler this way. Add task, we'll say add task number, and then we'll have tasks.length plus 1. So if we go back here, okay, what did I do here? It says add task 31, which isn't what we want. Add task, okay. I think we're going to have to wrap this in parentheses. Or we're going to have to parse the integer. Okay, that'll work. Add task 3. Add task 4. 5. So again, this is a stupid little use case. This is not something you would do in real life. but just to show how easy it is to bind values, that's why I put that in there. And we'll leave it because why not? Okay, so what do we need to do next? We need to be able to, we're not going to edit the tasks, but let's at least have the ability to delete the tasks and to toggle the tasks as completed or not completed. This is where you're going to see how interesting Vue really gets. But before we do that, let's separate this into a separate component, right? Because right now everything's in our app.vue component, and we don't want that. So let's open up our Explorer right here. Let's add a new component. I'll right click and do new file. And let's call this, we'll call it task list.vue. We have this empty file here now. We'll type vbase css. We have our template. Again, we're going to put name, and that's going to be task list. And there's a few different ways to go about this. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll show you what I would do if this was a real production application. We can take this list right here, and let's just copy it for now. I'm going to comment that out, and let's paste it in here. So the problem with this now is it's referencing the tasks value, but we don't have tasks in here. So this is where we're going to use something called props. The prop name, this is going to be the variable name. We're going to say that we want to reference tasks. What props is how you pass values from one component to another. Specifically, you pass things from a parent component to a child component. So we're saying that we're going to be passing in a value called tasks, or a variable called tasks. So we need to tell Vue how we want it to handle this. The type is an array. So we're going to type array like that. And the default, now I know this feels a little bit stupid. Normally, let's say that it's a string. If it's a string, you might have an empty string. If it's a number, maybe it's 0. If it's a Boolean, it might say true. But since it's an array, the way that you do that is you have an ES6 arrow function returning an empty array. So that will give us a default value of an empty array in case there's nothing there. But now that we've specified that it should be expecting tasks, suddenly our red squiggly line goes away because now it's referencing tasks. The only problem is we don't actually have any tasks being passed in yet. So the way that we do it is we import the component first and foremost, and we do that right under the script tag here. So import task list from components/tasklist.vue. Now you can see that it's a little bit faded. The way that we fix this, or the reason it's faded, is because we're not registering the component. In order to register the component, we create another, just like we have the computed right here, we add components. And then we give it the name of our component. So now we have this task list, and now it's just as bright as everything else. We take a look down here, it's registered, and now it's good to go. All we have to do is actually add the component as an HTML element tag. So we type in task list. It's self-closing, and let's take a look. Okay, so you see what's happening here right now is that the tasks are still in this main.app, this array of tasks right here, and it's not being passed into the task list, even though we have that property added. That's because we need to actually specify it by saying tasks equals tasks. Now again, we need to bind it because right now it thinks tasks right here is a string. As soon as we add the colon before it, it turns into a variable, which is referencing tasks in our data object, And now it's going to show up again. There we go. So there's a few other things that we need to be mindful of here. One of them is that our tasks are saved inside of this data object in the app.view component. We want to be able to edit the tasks. We want to be able to change the status complete from false to true when it's complete. But we're interacting with it on this child component here because we're passing the props in here before we render it. So we need to make it so that when we click on this, it tells the parent component, hey, we need to modify this task right here. We need to change this value on this task to this. So the way that we would do that is with something called an emitter. We're going to emit a value up to the parent component. And again, I know this sounds complicated. Don't worry about it. You're about to see how it's done. It's not as bad as you might think. First thing I'm going to do on this list item is, we'll add the styling in a second. Let me do this for now. Let's add task.complete. Let's take a look here. So we have false, false, false. They're all false. We want to be able to change that to true. And one more thing we can do, we can make this a ternary operator. So we can say if it's false, we want it to say nothing. We can put an empty string there. If it's true, we want to say done. So all of these say done right now. It's because I must have this backwards. If the task is complete, we want it to say done. Otherwise, we want it to be an empty string. Okay, there we go. That's better. So how do we mark this as done now? Let's say we want to click on it, and that's going to toggle the status. So the first thing we're going to do, and this is cool because this isn't a button right here. This is just a list item, but we can give it the same functionality that we would give a button. So we say on click, just like that. And now what do we want it to do? This is where we run into the problem with the emitters. We need to emit something to the parent component. We need to toggle the completed status. So let's say toggle complete handler. And now we need to create a method that does this. So we're going to go down here and let's add methods. We'll give it the name toggle complete handler. And so think about what we need to do here. We need to be able to say we're going to take task with the ID of 3 and we need to toggle the status of it. That means that we need to pass in either the ID or the index. Let's pass in the index because they're always going to be in the same order. Let's call that value I. So now, instead of just referencing the name here, we need to actually pass in the value. So when we click it, we're passing in this index. Even though it's declared after it, the at click is before the index is being instantiated, the framework knows how to handle it. So when we click on this list item now, if it's the first list item, it's going to call toggle complete handler while passing in the index of 0 to the method. So let's just do this. Let's say console log I. Let's actually add a little bit of text in here. We'll say the task at index I was clicked. So now let's see if that works. Let's just add another task, another 2 tasks. Now take a look down here at the console as I click these. The task at index 0 was clicked. The task at index 2 was clicked. 3, 1. So it's working, but we still have this this I type cursor. We're using Tailwind, so it's a real quick, easy fix to modify that. We just say class equals cursor pointer. Now when we hover over it, now we have the pointer. Okay, so now we have this method. It's able to access the index when we click on it. Now we need to pass that information to the app.view component. So the way that we're going to go about doing it is we're going to say this, because again, we're referencing this component, this dot emit, and that's going to be prefaced with the $. And I'll explain this in just a second. First, we just want to make sure it works. This dot emit, and then we need to say what we want it to emit. So the argument that we're going to pass in here is going to be what we're listening for on the parent element. I know it sounds confusing. It is a little bit confusing, but let's put a pin in this for a second and we'll come right back to it. On this task list component, just like we have an onClick listener where we say v onClick, or the shorthand for it, which is onClick, like that. What we can also do is instead of using click, we can make this say whatever we want the emitter to listen for. So we could say at toggle complete equals, and then let's just say, I'm actually not sure if this will work, but let's try it. Console log. I'm not sure if you can console log from the template, but we're about to find out. It worked. Let's try this. So it's called toggle complete, which means if we go to the task list, all we have to do is put in toggle complete. And now let's try this and see if it works. All right, so we click this, and we have an issue. Okay, you can't use console log in the template. I had a feeling that was going to be the case. So instead, I'm going to delete this. And let's go ahead and add a method called toggle complete. And again, we're going to want to pass in the index, but we're going to put a pin in that for a second. Let's just steal this console log here. And let's actually call it toggle complete handler, so that we can distinguish what the difference is between the left side and the right side. So we're going to rename this toggle complete handler, and then we'll paste this code in there. So let's try this again. We click one of these. There we go. It says it worked. Click another one. It worked. So the way that we pass the index into this is very simply, we give it a second argument, which is going to be the index. Now we can get rid of this. And this toggle complete handler. Let's go ahead and put the I in here for the index. Again, this can be whatever you want it to be named. So we'll say it worked. I was clicked. And let's see if that gives us what we're expecting. We click this. It worked. 0 was clicked. It worked. 1 was clicked. So, very cool. That's how easy it is to transfer data from a child component to a parent component. Now, I mentioned I was going to come back to this with the $sign here. There's a few things that you can use in Vue. Anything that's prefixed with the $sign, it means that it's essentially binded to the Vue instance. So if you're using your state management, which will be Vuex, or Pinia is another big one these days, or at least it's gaining popularity, you would do this dot store dot dispatch or dot getters, or whatever the case is, because you can bind it to Vue. You can actually do this if you go to your main file. I don't really want to refactor this right now, but you could say, okay, I'm going from memory here, but let's we'll say my app equals create app, and then again we're mounting this app right there, this app component. So we can say my app dot mount. Let's actually call this Vue with a capital V. I think that sort of meets the standard. That's what it used to be. So let's see if the app still works now. And I genuinely don't know because I haven't done this in a little while. But if we go back, the application's still working. Okay, very cool. The reason I did this is because the way that you would bind something to... I'm not actually sure this is going to work, but let's figure it out together. Vue.use my function. Let's give my function a name. Or let's give it something to do. Okay, I have no idea if this is going to work, but I have a function called myfunc. It's called HW for hello world. All it does is it logs hello world. Now if we say view.use, or we want to say HW, not H2. View.use HW. In theory, again, I'm not sure if this is going to work, but it'll be interesting to see. We should be able to say this dot $HW. See if we can invoke that. Okay, yeah, we have hello world right there. Let me make sure that's coming from where I think it is. Yeah, there we go. Hello world with 3 exclamation points. So, hopefully you understand what I'm trying to demonstrate here. Anything that's prefixed with that $sign is automatically going to be binded to your Vue application so that you can access or use it globally. So generally you're not going to be creating your own like I just did here. This is a little bit of a weird thing to do, but it's just to demonstrate that emit is binded to the Vue instance and Vue knows how to handle it. So anytime you see something prefixed with that $sign, that's what it means, is that it's binded to your entire Vue instance globally. We'll just go back here and revert this. There we go, back to normal. All right, so now if we go back to our app.vue, now we know that we have access to this index. We're passing that index in. So what we want to do now is we want to change this from complete false to complete true. We can say this dot tasks at index I dot complete equals, and we named it toggle, so we just want to make it the opposite of itself. So let's see if that works now. So if we click this, there we go. The word done pops up and it disappears when we click it again. So all we're doing is from the task list, when we click the list item, it's calling toggle complete handler, and we're passing in the index that's being generated in the v-for loop. Then it's emitting something called toggle complete with an argument of the index. Toggle complete is being listened for on the component with this v-on statement. So when it hears toggle complete, it's referencing the toggle complete handler method. The toggle complete handler has the index being passed into it as a parameter, and then we're referencing the tasks that are located on the app.vue, and we're setting the value of the task at index I.complete to the opposite of itself. So I know that that's a lot of jargon, but hopefully it's pretty simple because there's not a whole lot that's too complicated about it. So something else that we can do here, we have the ability to toggle this. It looks kind of stupid. Instead of making it say done, instead of making it say done, what we want to do, and this is one more thing that I think is really cool about Vue, is that because we have that binding, that vbind thing, where we just put the colon before it and it turns it into a variable, we can say task.complete, and if that's true, if task.complete is true, we want to add the styling called, I think, line through. Otherwise, we want to give it, well, we'll just say no styling, and we'll do this in a little bit of a nicer way as well. But we want to keep this cursor, which is a pointer. So one thing that's really cool, there's two ways to do this. I'll show you both of them. One of them would be that we make this an object. Okay, so we have this object right here now. And we can say that we want cursor pointer to always be true. So let's give this a value of 1 or true. And now the next value here, which is going to be line through, and I'm going to have to double check if that's what it's called. And we want line through to be an active style only when task.complete is true. Okay, so far so good. Let's take a look and see if that works. There we go. So now when we click it, we get that strike through there. When we click it again, it disappears. Another way that we can do this instead of using an object is we can make this an array. So we can get rid of, or let me put this all on the same line. We always want cursor pointer to be true because it's always going to be a pointer. So let's leave that as is. The next value in the array, I'm going to make that a ternary operator. And we're going to say task.complete. And if that's true, we want the line through. And let's just end the array. So cursor pointer is always going to be part of a style. Line through is only going to be part of the style when this is also true. So let's take a look. It should do the exact same thing. Personally, I prefer this unless you have, 10 different styles or something really crazy going on. You need more modular control of it. Otherwise, those are the two options for styling. So now we also want to add, let's say, a trash can so we can delete this. And let's just use an emoji. So let's pull up our emojis here. And we'll have the trash can. As a matter of fact, just since we're learning the framework, let's add another component. This would be a little bit of overkill, but this is something that I might do in a real project. Let's say I have a folder inside of my components folder, and I want to call it UI elements. So if I want a button, and the button's going to be repeatable, we'll add a file, and we'll call it deleteButton.view. We'll do vbase CSS, and let's go ahead and steal this trash can icon. We could change this div to a button. Now, the thing here is, I haven't mentioned this yet, but I've left a div at the root of every template. You don't have to do that in Vue 3. In Vue 2, you need at least one element to be the root element. You can't, for example, have something like this in Vue 2 without wrapping it in div or section or span or something like that. But since we're in Vue 3, we can just have two things side by side, or we can just put whatever we want to in there. Just pretend it's HTML. Now we're gonna have this trash can. So what we want to do here, first of all, we want to give it a name. All right, and now when we click this, we're going to have delete handler. Okay, we're going to have the delete task handler. I'm starting to think this actually is a pretty stupid idea. I'm going to be overcomplicating things if I do it this way, because we're going to have to do some prop drilling. So instead, I'm not going to add any functionality to this. Instead, I'm just going to use it for the sake of example. This will be a little bit more realistic. How about this? We can have the plus sign. We can have the X. And then we have the trash can. So let's say this will be a good example for VIF. And I'm sure you can imagine what VIF does. So let's add a prop in here. We're going to say we want to pass a value in. And let's call it button type. And let's rename this from delete button into custom button. All right, so we have this button type, and the type is going to be, let's say, a string. And the default is going to be, let's make this a check mark. That would be a little bit more normal. There we go. So let's say the default is check. Okay, so what we're going to do from here is we're going to add some VIF statements. So let's say VIF, which is a new one. This is going to work the same way that an if, else statement will work in JavaScript normally. We're going to say VIF button type equals check. Then we want to show this button. We could say else if button type equals X. Then we want to show this X button. And then we could say else, because there's only one more option. So if it's not check and if it's not X, then we want the trash. And this should work. Now let's also make it so when we click it, we'll say on click, we want to say emit, and we don't have to use the this because we're in the template. We can just say emit equals button clicked. So now if we go back to our task list, let's import that custom button component. And again, I have that autocomplete there. I'm just going to delete the view at the end. So it's import custom button from UI elements custom button.view. We're going to register the component. We'll paste that in there. So now we have access to our custom button. Let's put the custom button in here. And let's add flex to this so that they're in line with each other. And what did we call? Okay, it's called button type. You see how my IntelliSense is filling that out for me? We'll say button type equals trash. Let's take a look at it. Okay, so we have an issue there. First of all, first and foremost, we don't want that flex there. What we do want is to change this to a span or a div. And we'll again wrap it in an unordered list. And now we can give it a flex. And it won't throw off our... Am I missing something here? Ah, I see what I'm doing. We don't want this custom button up there. We want it right there. Okay. That should be fine. But without the flex. Okay, I'm just going to delete that. We'll change this to UL. And get rid of that. Alright, should be good. There we go. Back to normal. So we're saying, where is it? we're saying that we want the button type to be trash. Do you see what the issue is with this? It should be obvious. The issue is that we have our binding set up. We're not binding it. We're trying to pass a string in there. So if I get rid of that, there we go. Now we have our trash cans. If you want to keep that binding in there for any reason, you just need to wrap this in an extra set of strings, and everything will work. But it sees it as a JavaScript expression, which means that you need to specify that it's a string if for any reason you don't have that. So that's how we're going to do it. That's where we're going to get our trash button from. And just for the sake of best practices, let's wrap this in a span. And then let's give this a flex value. And then let's also give this custom button, or no, we'll do it with the span. We'll say class equals ML for margin left is going to be 4. We have a little bit of spacing now. It looks a little bit better. When we click it, it gets crossed out. The only problem is we don't want to cross out the trash can also. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this onClick event here. We're going to put that on the span instead. I'm sorry, that's not what we do. We're going to leave that there, but we're going to take this class and we're going to apply that class to this span, and we'll take this ML4 and move it inside of here. And then we'll get rid of that flex. And we'll put it back up here. All right, is that it? Margin, oh, I'm sorry. This margin left 4 needs to go over here because it's not conditional. There we go. Okay, everything's working correctly now. When we click this, it's not doing anything. So it says set, all right, something about a proxy there. That doesn't matter. When we click it, it's emitting something, except the syntax is wrong. Sorry about that. We don't want to say equals. We want to pass in the value button clicked. Which means that we need to add the event listener now. So the event listener on task list is going to say button clicked equals, what do we want that to do? Delete task. Okay, so same thing as we did before. We're going to go to our methods, and we're going to type delete task. We'll make it delete task handler to keep it accurate. So we'll console log the index. We're going to pass in the index the same way that we did last time. Let me just kind of clean this up a little bit. All right, so when the button is clicked, we're going to call it delete task handler. And we're going to pass in the index to this delete task handler. So again, good for any of you that caught that, because I definitely screwed up by binding it. We don't want to bind it. We want to add an event listener, which is with the @ symbol. So when button clicked is emitted, then it's going to call delete task handler with the index of I, which means that we need to pass the index in here. The way that we do this is by passing the index in here. However, I didn't realize this at first, but this is going to be a little bit more complicated than I thought. But I think it's still a good example. The problem is, where is this index coming from? Because this isn't a loop, right? We don't have any sort of loop here. So where's this coming from? We're going to have to pass that in. We do have access to the index right here. So on this custom button, we can say that we want to pass in, we'll say index equals I. Now we're going to have to go to our props and add index. It's going to be type integer. Well, the type's going to be number, capital N. And the default, we'll just make that 0. Okay, so let's see if it's working. We have the index, which is going to be different for each time that this component is rendered. We're going to have to reference it by name. So instead of I, we're going to say index. And hopefully you guys can follow this. Let me see. Make sure no one is lost. Okay, I don't even know if there's anyone here. But if anyone is watching and anyone is lost, just just send a message or jump in the voice chat or something. Okay, let's see if it's working. The way that it should work now is when we click this, there we go. We have index 0 logging out right there. Index 1. Let's take a look at our task list component. And that's all we're doing is, we'll say delete I. Now if we try it again. Okay, delete 0, delete 1. So now we have the correct index attached to the correct list item. And it's passing the correct data to the correct component. So again, everything's working the way we want it to. There's one more thing that gets sort of complicated here. We're going to have to emit another value up from this task list component to the app.view component. And what we need to do is, because that object, the array of our task objects, because that's on our app.view file, this is where we need to edit it. So if someone wants to delete a task, what we're going to do is we're going to add an event listener onto this task list component. I'm going to format this so it looks a little bit nicer. And our event listener here is going to be called delete event. And let's give it a method name of delete event handler. Let's go ahead and create this as a method. And what it's going to do is it's going to say this.tasks at index I. Index I, of course, we're going to be passing into this method. So this.tasks at index I, that's what we want to get rid of. So the way that we do this in JavaScript is we would say this.tasks.splice, and then it's going to be the index, and then how many values do we want to remove? That's going to be 1. So let's see what happens if we do this. We need to be able to call the delete event handler by using this delete event listener. So if we go to our task list, now we say this.emit delete event, and we're going to pass in I. Now if we take a look at this, you notice that we don't have to do anything like this. We don't have to pass it in. All this is right here is it's a reference to the method. So it's just going to pass that index. It's going to essentially not flow through this. It's just going to redirect the index to the method that this is referencing. So let's see if that works. We click this trash bin. There we go. It's gone. That one's gone. We refresh it. It's there. Let's add some more tasks. And there we go. Gone, gone, gone. So we're having an issue here saying cannot read properties of undefined, reading complete. Let's see where we're getting this issue. I think if we add that question mark there, that might fix it. If I'm being honest, I don't feel like really debugging it right now. I'm sure it's nothing too complicated, but that I'm not sure exactly what had happened that would cause that to be an issue. Unless it has something to do with the fact that we're adding one. When we want to add a new item, we're taking the length of the list and adding one to it. And I wonder if that becomes a problem when we don't have that last value there to refer to. Cannot set properties of undefined. Setting complete. All right, I'm going to come back to that one. Don't worry about that right now because it really doesn't matter. There's probably a better way to do that anyways. But I think our app is working the way that we need it to at this point. So, task 3, task 4, task 5, task 6. We can cross them off to mark them as completed, or we can delete them when we're done with them. Except when we delete that last one, that's why it's an issue. Because if it's taking the length and it's adding 1 to it, and then we don't have that value, the length would be 0. It should be adding 1 to it. That might not actually be the problem. But anyways, don't worry about that. We have our to-do list written in Vue.js. And for all intents and purposes, this thing is done for right now. And that's Vue 3. Let's just get rid of... Let's get rid of these default tasks here. There's another directive that I do want to show you, though. And that's going to be, for example, we have this task list component right here. What we can do is we can conditionally render this with vif. Say vif tasks.length. So we only want to render it if we have tasks, right? So there's nothing there, but now it's showing up. If we get rid of these, the component disappears. However, another way that we can do this, if we don't want to use like the if else and we just want to hide it if there's nothing there, or let's actually use an else statement right here just to see an example. Let's make this an h2. We'll say class equals font semi-bold text XL, and then we'll make it say no tasks, and let's just let's center it actually. Okay, no, and let's give it a margin on the top of 8. We'll make the text 2XL, and let's get rid of the semi-bold so it doesn't match the title. Okay, there we go. It says no tasks. And now, as we have tasks, it's still there. Why is that happening? It's because we don't have VElse here. Alright, no tasks. Now we have tasks. We delete these. No tasks. Now, if we don't want to show that, another way that we can do this would just be to say v show. So we only want to show this if our tasks have a length. We can get rid of this, and instead of using that if else statement, it's only going to show it if we have it there. And if we get rid of it, let's actually look at the DOM, because this is sort of interesting. Where is it here? There we go. See, this div the style is set to display none. That's because we use vshow. So what it does is it essentially just gets rid of the CSS. Or it changes the display to none within the CSS rather. So it's still there, it's still rendering, it's just not showing. And that is a to-do list with Vue.js. I'm trying to think real quick before I wrap this up if there's any last features I'd want to show that I haven't already shown. I really love Vuex. If you've ever used Redux, Vuex is just like a 1,000 times better version control system. And I guess before I finish the video, we'll debug this. Let's actually try to figure out why we're getting this error. And one more thing is we're going to check out the Vue DevTools, which is just an application, an extension rather. You can install it from the Chrome store using any Chromium browser. Now you can also see here if we open the Vue DevTools, we have our two components, our app component and our task list component. And we should get a third component if as soon as we render a task, we should get that button. There we go. Now there's our custom button. If we add another one, we should get another custom button. So this will show us the state of each of our items here. Now on our task list, we have our tasks, which are reactive items, because the DOM needs to re-render when any of those values are updated. So when we do this, you see the value change complete is going from true to false. And it's re-rendering the DOM, or at least that particular element of the DOM. If we go to our app, we can see that new task is a blank string. As soon as we start typing, that's weird. This should be updating. I'm guessing that that's probably just a bug with this particular extension. No big deal there. Yeah, it looks like this is sort of lagging. I bet if I refresh it. Yeah, see? The Vue DevTools, they're usually really good. I might have a beta version installed right now or something. If you have Vuex, there will be a button here. It'll recognize that you're using Vuex. And I wish there was a little bit more time. I don't want to be at this all night, but I love Vuex, and I would really love to show an example of it. Maybe that could be a project for a different time. It's just adding state management to this particular project. But now, before we call it a day, let's just debug this error we're getting. Let's kind of talk through it, see if we can figure out what the problem is. And if anyone is here, and if you have any idea what it might be, shoot a message over and let me know, because it's going to take me a minute to figure it out. It seems to be almost random. It's going to pop up now with an error right there. So it's saying, oh, okay, this might actually be really easy. Toggle complete handler. So we're referencing the toggle complete handler. I think I see what's happening. The toggle complete handler all right, we can just add we can add a guard onto this. We'll say if this dot tasks dot length is less than 1, return. Let's see if that fixes it, because we don't ever want to try to invoke this if we don't have at least one task. So let's see if that's what it is. I'm a little bit skeptical that that's going to fix it, but let's find out. Okay, yeah, that did fix it. All right, very cool. All right, we're getting the same one. Okay, let's do this. Let me try changing the logic on this a little bit. And let me also make sure I'm not using the word completed anywhere. Okay. So we're going to say const current task completed status, current task complete status equals this dot tasks at index I dot complete const new complete value, and we're going to make this the opposite. Then we'll say this dot tasks at index I complete equals new complete value, and we can change this from this dot task at that index. We'll change it to current task complete status. Okay, let's see if we still get the error now. I feel like this is one of those things that if I was fresh, if it was first thing in the morning, it would be incredibly obvious to me. But burned out and tired at the end of the day, yeah, I'm missing something. Alright, looks like we're not getting that error anymore. I think it was just the shorthand I was using, because we were referencing something after it was technically deleted for a split second. Yeah, that's our application. Let me just do this. I will throw this up on GitHub. I'll show you how to make a new repo. So we're going to go to GitHub, we're going to say new repo, and we're going to call this Vue live stream to do task app from May 3, 2022 live stream on YouTube. We'll make it public so you guys can steal this code, and we'll say create repository. We'll just copy all this right here because we're creating a new repo. We'll go to our terminal, open up a new window for it. I'll paste it in there. And now if we go back to GitHub and we refresh, there it is. Oh, well, not the whole thing, just the README, because that's all we added to source control. So if we do git add period, period means everything. Everything that's not in this git ignore file, at least. So we're going to say git add everything. Again, node modules is in here. So is the dist. We don't ever want to push the node modules or the distribution folder, you know, the build folder. We don't want to send that to GitHub. And then we're going to say git commit finished app git push. Now if we go back, we refresh, and there we go. Here's the application. Perfect.